In the quiet English countryside exists a legend so chilling it is rarely spoken of today. Dead livestock, windows covered with iron bars, and a fire to purge it once and for all. This episode will take you through a series of terrifying events with an unexpected twist. A twist suggesting that it might just be true. You won't want to miss this one. On a cold March morning in 1871, about a dozen men stood in a circle around a holly tree in a churchyard in Cumberland, England. They'd been there since before dawn, and they'd built a pyre, which is basically a big pile of wood soaked in oil right at the base of this holly tree. And all these men lived in the area. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and of course the village blacksmith. But this morning, they were terrified. Some of them were praying, others were holding crosses, and they were all staring at this object. What was on the pyre looked like it could have been a bundle of old leather, or maybe some kind of dried meat. It was brown and shriveled. As one of the men stood there, one of them, an elderly farmer, stepped forward with a torch in hand. He looked at the other men and basically said, "This ends today." And then he touched the torch to the oil-soaked wood. The fire caught immediately, and as the flames rose higher and higher and began to consume this object that was on the pyre, several of the men would later swear that something very strange happened. They all stood there watching until there was nothing left but ash. And then they took those ashes and they scattered them, some in the churchyard, some in the nearby river, some they buried in different locations around the village. They wanted to make absolutely sure that whatever they had just burned was entirely done away with. To understand why these men were so terrified of what they were burning, to understand why they felt the need to scatter the ashes, we need to go back to the spring and summer of the previous year. This episode is sponsored by Mint Mobile. Now, in this story, whenever a bunch of villagers are standing around burning something, it's never good news. But I can tell you what they weren't burning: money. Unlike you with your current phone bill. Mint Mobile reimagined the whole wireless thing and they moved it online. I mean, you don't got to deal with stores. You don't got to deal with salespeople lurking around trying to prey on you. You just go to mintmobile.com, you set everything up from home, boom, that's it. What's great is you get premium wireless with unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network, plus hotspot on the unlimited plan, and even free calling to Mexico, Canada, and the UK. In fact, coverage hits about 98% of Americans on 5G and 99% on 4G LTE. So you can listen to tales like this pretty much anywhere without worrying about signal or, losing your service out in the middle of the woods. And they also do something that I actually like a lot, which is bulk buying for wireless. You can choose from a 3, 6, or a 12-month plan up front, and you save over time. You're not locked into this one-size-fits-all data plan either. I mean, you can pick between 5 gigabytes, 15, or 20, or you can go unlimited, just depending on how much you actually use. And if that doesn't seal the deal for you, you can activate in minutes with eSIM, which means you keep your number and you either bring your own phone or you grab a new one through Mint. For you, that means burning anything under a holly tree isn't required. And for a limited time this holiday season, you can get 50% off an unlimited premium wireless plan from Mint. You lock in Mint's lowest price of the year and pay $15 a month for a 3, 6, or 12-month plan. I mean, that's pretty sweet. Just go to mintmobile.com. In fact, you can click the link in the description below to check it out. Now, back to the episode. In May of 1870, 3 siblings, Amelia, Edward, and Michael Cranswell, arrived in Cumberland, England, looking for a fresh start. They were from London originally, but their parents had recently died, leaving them a pretty substantial inheritance. So the siblings, who were all in their 20s, decided they wanted to get away from all the noise and the smells and crowds of London and just find somewhere quiet out in the countryside to live. And that's how they ended up in Cumberland, which is way up in the north of England near the Scottish border. It's all rolling hills and sheep farms and these tiny villages where everybody knows everybody. And when the Cranswells arrived, They were immediately charmed by just how peaceful it was, and the house they found to rent was called Croglan Grange. It was this one-story stone house that had been owned by the Fisher family for generations. But the Fishers had actually recently moved to London, basically doing the opposite of what the Cranswells were doing, and they needed someone to rent their ancestral home. The lease was for 7 years, which was a long commitment, but the moment the Cranswells saw the property, they knew it was perfect. The house sat on this little hill surrounded by gardens, and from the front windows, you had this view of the village church and its churchyard, which was maybe 100 yards away. Close enough that you could see people coming and going, but far enough that it felt private. Now, I should mention something about Amelia. She was the youngest of the siblings, probably about 22 years old at the time, and she had spent most of her life in London taking care of her very, very sick mother. And she never really had the chance to just be young, to experience and have her own life. So this move to Cumberland, for her, it was a huge opportunity to finally start fresh and actually live her life. And at first, it was everything she'd hoped for. I mean, the people were incredibly welcoming, and within a week of the Cranswells moving in, they had all been invited to like 3 different dinner parties. Edward, who was the oldest, started getting involved with some local business ventures. Michael, the middle child, started courting the daughter of a local farmer, and Amelia threw herself into fixing the gardens up all around the Croglan Grange. By the time summer arrived, the Cranswells had completely settled into their new life. They had friends, they had routines. Like every Sunday, they'd walk to church. Every Wednesday, Amelia would go into the village to buy supplies. Every Friday, they'd have dinner with the vicar and his wife. I mean, it was just perfect. This was exactly what they'd wanted when they left London. But in late July of 1870, this massive heat wave hit northern England. The Croglan Grange, being this old stone house with tiny windows, it just trapped heat like an oven. As you guys can imagine, during the day, it was bearable, but at night, it was absolutely miserable. The Cranswells started staying up later and later. They'd sit outside on the veranda, waiting for it to finally cool down enough that they could actually go and sleep. They'd sit out there talking, playing cards. Sometimes they would just sit in silence, listening to the crickets. And on one of these nights, it was probably around July 25th or 26th, they finally decided at about 11 p.m. that they should really try and get some sleep. So they all went to their rooms. Edward and Michael shared a room on one side of the house. Amelia had her room on the opposite side. Now, Amelia's room had this big window that looked out toward the churchyard, and Amelia had been debating whether to open her window. On one hand, she desperately wanted the breeze, but on the other, she was still a city girl at heart, and she didn't know what kind of animals might be out there in the countryside at night. So she just decided to leave it closed, but not latched. That way, if a breeze came up, it might push the window open a little. So she got into bed, and she's laying there in the dark, and it's really hot, so she can't think straight, and she's just absolutely miserable. At this point, she's been laying there for maybe 20 minutes when she notices something through her window. Out in the churchyard, she could see what looks like 2 small lights moving around the headstones. And at first she thinks, well, somebody must be visiting a grave out there. Maybe they're leaving flowers or something. But then she realizes that it's nearly midnight. Who visits a grave at midnight? So she sits up a little to get a better look. And you know how when someone carries a lantern, it kind of like bobs up and down as they walk? Well, these lights were not doing that. They were staying exactly the same height. And they were moving in a strange pattern. Like they'd go behind a headstone and then kind of come out from one side and then disappear again. Amelia does not know who this person is, why they're out there at this time of night, and why she's suddenly feeling very uncomfortable, but she is. And because of this, she's really looking intently because she just has to know who this person is. The more she's looking, these lights don't exactly look like a lantern. They actually look more like animal eyes reflecting light. But that doesn't make sense either, because what animal has eyes that are 5 feet off the ground? And suddenly, as she finishes that thought, the lights go out entirely. And now she's realizing that whoever this is, whatever animal is out there, is still there. And so she's straining to look, and for maybe 30 seconds, she can't see a thing. And then the lights appear again. But now they're not in the churchyard, they're in the field between the churchyard and the house, and they're moving toward her window. Amelia's watching these lights, or whatever they are, moving across the field toward her, and as they get closer, she can kind of start to make out a shape in the darkness. Her first thought is, you know what? This has to be a neighbor. Maybe someone's drunk and got confused about which house is theirs. Amelia can see that it's not really walking, it's almost kind of gliding. Now it's about 20 feet from her window. She could see that those lights that she was looking at were definitely eyes. At this point, she wants to scream, she wants to call out for her brothers, but she's frozen. She literally cannot move or make a sound, and this figure walks right up to her window and it just stops. And it's looking at her, but she can't make out features in the darkness, but she can see the outline of a head, shoulders, and arms. So clearly it's just a human being. But there's something about all of this that is so fundamentally wrong. And then the figure does something that completely chills Amelia. It reaches up with one hand and starts running its fingers along the window frame like it's feeling for something. And then she can hear this scratching sound. It's like metal on metal, and she realizes what's happening. Her window is one of those old diamond-paned windows where the glass is held together with lead strips. And then she hears this scratching sound, like metal on metal, and she realizes right then and there what's happening. And this figure is using a tool, like a knife. Her paralysis breaks. She realizes that this person, once they get through that window, there's nothing between them and her. So she jumps out of bed, she runs to her bedroom door to get to her brothers, but when she gets to the door, it's locked. And she doesn't remember locking it, but the key is still in on the lock, so she must have locked it without thinking. So she turns the key to unlock it, but her hands are shaking so badly that she drops the key and it falls on the floor, and she's on her hands and knees in the dark trying to find it, and behind her, she could hear more glass falling onto her bedroom floor. This person is almost through, and so she finally finds the key, she gets the door open, she runs down the hallway, she's screaming for her brothers, Edward, Michael, and they come running out of the room. Amelia's hysterical, she's pointing back toward her room, trying to explain, but she can't get the words out of her mouth because she's so worked up. And so Edward, realizing his sister is in danger, grabs a fire poker, and with Michael, he grabs a candlestick, which is really the only weapons they could find, and they run back to Amelia's room. When they get there, they see that the window is destroyed. There's glass over the floor, the lead strips are bent and twisted, and there's blood on some of the glass. Whoever did this had cut themselves in the process, but the room is empty. So whoever had been trying to get in was now gone. Now the brothers, not really knowing what to do, just immediately went outside with lanterns to look for whoever had done this, and then they found footprints in the dirt below Amelia's window. Now the strange thing is that the footprints led from the churchyard to the window, but there were no footprints leading away. It's like whoever made them just disappeared. And so they searched the grounds, they checked into the churchyard, they even woke up some of the neighbors to ask if they'd seen anything. But of course, as these stories go, nobody had seen or heard anything unusual. The next morning, they sent for the constable. And when he arrived and he saw the window, his entire demeanor changed. He went from being kind of annoyed that he'd been called out for what he assumed was just a simple break-in to being extremely serious. He just grabbed Edward, he took him aside, away from where Amelia could hear, and he just asked him, did anyone actually get into the room? But Edward told him no, that they'd gotten there just in time and they had stopped whoever this perpetrator was. Then he asked, did your sister get a look at the intruder? But Edward could only tell him that his sister saw someone, but it was too dark, and so she couldn't make out the features of what this man looked like. And then he told Edward something he would never forget. He said, sometimes it's better not to see. Now, the constable officially reported it as an attempted burglary by an escaped lunatic from a nearby asylum. That's actually what he wrote in his report. That's what he told the newspapers. But privately, he advised the Cranswells to leave Cumberland for a while. And he said that there had been incidents in the past, and it would just be safer if they weren't around for a bit. He wouldn't really elaborate on what he meant by incidents, but the Cranswells knew that it was serious. They took his advice, They decided that they would pack up and they would go to Switzerland for 6 months. They told people they were going for Amelia's health, that, she needed mountain air to recover from the shock. But really, they were just scared. They didn't understand what had happened, but they knew it wasn't normal. Now, months later, in January of 1871, the Cranswells came back to the Crogland Grange. And since their last stay, they've made some changes. They'd had all the windows reinforced with iron bars. They'd put new locks on all the doors. Edward and Michael now slept in the room next to Amelia's, with the door open so that way they could hear if anything had happened. And, not being dumb, they kept loaded pistols on their nightstands in case something was to go down. Everything was pretty much back to normal. But while they were gone, other people in the area had strange experiences. Apparently, farmers had been finding dead animals all over the area. Sheep mostly, but also some cows and even a few dogs. Now, these animals weren't eaten. They weren't torn apart, but they did find strange wounds on their bodies that they could not explain. The farmers just blamed wild dogs. That was the official explanation. But Edward noticed that none of the farmers seemed to actually believe it was wild dogs. They were scared. They were keeping their animals locked up at night, and some of them were sitting up with shotguns, keeping watch. And so things were pretty serious for a while. But in early March, remember, this is now just a few days before that scene I described at the beginning, with the men burning something at the base of a holly tree. Amelia woke up in the middle of the night because she heard a familiar sound. It was that scratching, and it was at her window. But this time, she didn't freeze. She didn't freak out. She immediately called out for her brothers. So Edward and Michael came running in with their pistols. They were ready for action. Michael, like Arnold Schwarzenegger out of a 1980s movie, kicked the door in, and he burst into her room to protect her, while Edward ran outside to catch whoever was out there. Edward actually saw him. This man was running across the field toward the churchyard, running in that same strange kind of gliding motion that Amelia had originally described. Edward didn't care. He didn't hesitate. He aimed his pistol and fired at this man. The man kind of stumbled. Edward, he saw he had definitely hit him. And he saw the man grab his leg, and he heard him make this sound. It was kind of like this wheezing, screaming sound. It's hard to explain, but he just kept running, and he's kind of, hobbling, and he ran straight into the churchyard. And then with all of his strength, he vaulted over the wall with one hand, even though it was wounded, and disappeared among all the headstones. Edward ran after him, hoping to put an end to this guy, but by the time he got to the churchyard, this mysterious man was gone. However, there was a blood trail on the ground. Edward could see that there was blood on top of the wall where this person had vaulted over. And there was bloody footprints leading through the churchyard. And as Edward notices the blood trail, he's like, check and mate, I got you now. So he followed them, and they led to the old section of the churchyard where the really ancient graves were. And then the footprints stopped right in front of an old crypt. An old stone crypt that belonged to a family called the Hawthorns, who had left the area like 200-something years before this. Not sure what to make of this, and thinking that whoever this man is hiding in the crypt, so he's got to be quiet, he's got to sneak up on this guy. He realized that what if he's walking into a trap? What if they have a weapon? So he didn't really feel safe pursuing things further, at least not by himself. So he's like, you know what? I got a great idea. So he returned back home, and an entire day goes by. Nobody hears nothing. But that following morning, Edward and Michael had gathered up about a dozen local men. They didn't tell them exactly what they were looking for, just that somebody who'd attacked the house might be hiding out in the old Hawthorne crypt. When they all got to the churchyard, some of the older men immediately understood what was happening. One of them, a farmer in his 70s, actually tried to leave. He flat out told them, "Look, fellas, I'm not gonna go in there. My grandfather told me do not go in there." But Edward convinced him to stay. He said they needed to end this, whatever it was, and put a stop to this lunatic who won't stop obsessing over their house and trying to get to Amelia. So they all worked their best to pry open the door to the crypt, and the smell that came out was horrendous. It wasn't just the smell of decay or must, which you'd expect from an old crypt, but there was something else, like there's this metallic odor like blood. So, they went inside with lanterns and the crypt was a mess. Most of the coffins, unfortunately, had been smashed open. There were bones scattered around. But in the back corner, there was one coffin that was intact. Well, sort of. The lid had been pulled aside, just enough for someone to get in and out. And the men quietly approached the coffin, and even before they looked inside, they could see fresh blood on the edge. And it was still wet. So they pulled the lid all the way off, and inside was something shaped like a human, but the skin was brown and leathery like it had been dried out for decades. The lips were pulled back, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp, and the fingernails were more like claws. And there, in this thing's leg, was a fresh bullet wound, still bleeding. One of the older farmers crossed himself and just said, "God help us all. The stories were true." That's when Edward learned that there had been incidents like this before, in 1680, in 1742, in 1803. Each time, someone had been attacked. And the attacks had stopped, of course, after something was burned near the holly tree in the churchyard. The men knew what they had to do. They lifted the corpse out of the coffin, and several of them would later swear that it moved when they touched it. Just a little, like it was trying to resist. And they carried it out to the holly tree, they built a pyre, and as I described at the beginning, they burned it until there was nothing left but ash. And after the burning, the attacks stopped immediately. No more dead animals, no more visitors in the night. The Cranswells actually completed their 7-year lease at the Crogland Grange, though Amelia never really slept well again. She actually went on to marry a local doctor in 1873 and moved to London, where she lived until 1891. She never really spoke publicly about what happened. Edward and Michael did stay in Cumberland. They became successful businessmen, and they also never spoke about that night. But Edward did something very interesting before he passed away. He donated money to the church to maintain the grounds. Specifically, he paid for a new iron fence around the old section of the churchyard, and he insisted that the Hawthorne crypt be sealed with iron bars and cement, which it remains sealed to this day. The window in Amelia's old room at Crogland Grange was bricked up the day after the burning. If you visit the house now, it's now called Crogland Low Hall. You can still see where the window used to be. The current owners have put horseshoes above it, iron horseshoes. What the Cranswell siblings had encountered is famously known as the Crogland vampire, and was allegedly responsible for all the dead animals found with strange wounds. Puncture wounds on their neck with the blood drained. Now, you'd think that would be the end of the story, right? Okay, it's an urban legend. Big deal. Well, there's more than that. The creature was burned, the attack stopped, the Cranswells moved on with their lives. It's just an urban legend. There's nothing fancy going on. Well, in 1896, about 25 years after the burning, a British author named Augustus Hare published his autobiography. And in this book, buried among all these stories about his travels and his family, there was a chapter about the Crogland Grange vampire. Augustus claimed he had heard this story directly from a man named Captain Fisher. And if that name sounds familiar, it should. The Fisher family owned Crogland Grange. They were the Cranswells' landlords, and according to Captain Fisher, everything I told you in this episode actually happened. His family had documentation. They had letters from the Cranswells describing attacks. They had the constable's actual reports. Not the sanitized ones that he filed officially, but his real notes about what he found. When the book came out, it caused a sensation because, Augustus was known for telling wild stories. Some true, some just embellished. And people wanted to know, was this one of the true ones? In the 1900s, a man named Charles Harper decided that he was going to prove once and for all that the Crogland Grange vampire was nothing more than a story. Charles was what you'd call a professional skeptic. He'd spent time writing books about debunking ghost stories and all the urban legends, and he was convinced that this silly vampire tale was just another hoax. So he actually traveled to Cumberland. He was going to find the Crogland Grange, interview people, and expose the whole thing as just fiction. He ran into problems. He couldn't find the Crogland Grange. He found Crogland High Hall, he found Crogland Low Hall, but there was no Crogland Grange. And when he asked people about it, they got really weird. They changed the subject, or they would say that they simply didn't know what he was talking about. In fact, there was an old farmer who literally just turned and walked away when Charles mentioned the whole vampire thing. Without really anything else he could do, he went to the Croglan Low Hall, which seemed the most likely candidate for being the house in the story. But again, there were problems. The house had 2 stories, not 1, and the nearest church was a mile away. Again, too far to see someone in the churchyard from a bedroom window. And when Charles checked the church records, there was no mention of any Hawthorne family crypt. So he realized that, you know what? I got it. This is a hoax. This is all fake. He published his findings in a book called Haunted Houses. His conclusion, the whole thing was made up. Maybe Augustus Hare invented it, or maybe Captain Fisher was pulling his leg. Either way, none of this, it didn't happen. It's all fiction. But in 1963, almost 40 years after Charles Harper's investigation, another researcher named Francis Clive Ross decided to take a stab at the case. But Francis did something that Charles had not done. Instead of just looking at official records and maps, he talked to some of the oldest people around, families who'd been in the area for centuries, and what they told him changed everything. Firstly, Croglan Low Hall had been called Croglan Grange, but the name was changed in the early 1700s. By the time Charles Harper visited in the 1920s, nobody used that old name anymore, at least not officially. Second, the house originally had only 1 story. The second was added in the 1880s after the Cranswells had left. Francis actually found the building records that proved this. And third, there had been a chapel much closer to the house, but was torn down in 1890. But the foundation was still visible if you knew where to look. Now, from the original 1-story house, you absolutely could have seen into that chapel's graveyard. But when he was talking to a woman in her 90s whose grandfather had worked for the Fisher family, she told him something very fascinating. She basically said that my grandfather told me never to go near the old Hawthorne vault, which is a strange thing to say because there is no Hawthorne vault. However, she explained that to him, he's correct, there isn't one anymore. But back in 1871, they filled it with concrete right after the burning. Still not 100% satisfied, he kept digging, and he found things that nobody else had looked for. In the church records, not the official church records, but the personal diary of a minister from the 1680s, there was an entry that read this: "The thing in the Hawthorne vault has been destroyed. May God forgive us for what we had to do." 1680. Remember that date? That's 190 years before the Cranswell incident. Francis also found something else. In the Fisher family papers, which were stored in a trunk in the attic of one of their descendants, there was a letter, and it was from Amelia Cranswell to Mrs. Fisher, dated March 15th, 1871, which was just days after the burning. And it read, "I cannot thank your family enough for your discretion in this matter. Please know that we will honor our lease despite recent events. We only ask that you not speak of this to anyone. The thing is dead. Let it remain so in memory as well as body." But the most compelling evidence Francis found wasn't in any document. It was at Croglan Low Hall itself. The current owners, when Francis asked them about the bricked-up window, just said that they'd bought the house in 1955 and they'd wanted to restore that window, and they'd start removing the bricks. But when they got about halfway through, they found something behind the bricks that made them stop, because there was a piece of parchment sealed in wax, and written on it in old-fashioned script were the words, "This portal once admitted evil. Let it remain forever sealed." They put the bricks back, added the horseshoes for good measure, and they never touched it again. The attacks in 1870 to 1871 were not the first. They weren't even the second. In 1680, a woman named Sarah Hawthorne was found dead in her bed with wounds on her throat. Her husband, Thomas Hawthorne, was suspected of murder, but before he could be tried, he vanished. 3 months later, after several more deaths, something was burned at the holly tree. In 1742, a child named William Croft reported seeing a brown man with bright eyes at his window. 2 weeks later, William was dead. A week after that, something was burned at the holly tree. In 1803, a whole family, the Ridleys, left Cumberland suddenly in the middle of the night. They never came back. The next day, something was burned at the holly tree. Each time, the records claimed it was different things: wild dogs, disease, murder. But each time the burning happened, and each time the problems stopped, until 1870, when the Cranswells rented Crogland Grange. There is one final piece to this puzzle, and this, folks, is the twist that is going to blow your mind. In 1968, a reverend named Matthew Roberts, who had served at Crogland Church, according to church tradition, not written records, but stories passed down orally from minister to minister, the thing in the Hawthorne vault wasn't the only one. There had been another incident, sometime between 1804 and 1837, involving the daughter of Reverend Joseph Ireland. She had been attacked in exactly the same way as Amelia Cranswell, but that time, the thing that attacked her didn't come from the Hawthorne vault. Are you ready for this? It came from the tomb of Reverend George Sanderson, who had been the rector of Crogland Church back in the 1600s. That the Crogland vampire was actually the deceased Reverend George Sanderson. For whatever reason, he had become some sort of undead thing and would feast upon the lifeblood of the living to sustain himself. In the 1871 burning, they only burned one body. They only found one creature in the Hawthorne vault. So the question is, how many more vaults are there in that churchyard? And more importantly, are they all still sealed? All of it remains a mystery. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment down below, "out for blood." So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. And never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next episode.